Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And what I want to focus on today is the response of Gandhi, Nehru, and the other leading political figures in India to the fall of France and the successes of Germany in Europe in the summer of 1940, and how that begins to change the political situation in India. Now, if you've been listening to the previous podcasts I've done on the subject of India at the start of the Second World War, you'll know that the Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, declared war on Germany unilaterally without advising or taking the advice of Congress, and the political fallout of this was immense. It caused greater resentment. There were divisions already between the Muslim League, Muhammad Ali Jinnah's Muslim League, and the Hindu-dominated Congress Party, and these are accentuated by the outbreak of war and by the scramble to take political positions as war began. The British cynically hoped for these kinds of divisions. They hoped that they would be able to drive a wedge between the two forces, perhaps bringing Jinnah on side with the British. And these kind of crises that are brought to a head in the summer of 1940, and things begin to fundamentally change at that point, as we shall see. Now, today again, I'm reading from Srinath Raghavan's excellent book, India's War. And he writes, the German Blitzkrieg in the spring of 1940 stunned India, as the Wehrmacht punched its way through to the Channel coast and Paris. A spasm of fear coursed through many parts of the country. After the fall of France, the Viceroy sought information on the impact of German successes on the Indian public. These reports spoke of general bewilderment and some depression and nervousness as to the nearing possibility that India might actually be subject to attack. In some places, there was evidence of panic as well. There has been an unusually heavy withdrawals from the Indian Post Office Savings Bank, a key indication of alarm in rural and small-town India. In cities too, there are substantial drawings from bank accounts, though there was no run on the banks. So widespread was the panic that even Gandhi felt impelled to issue a public statement urging the people not to hastily withdraw their deposits or turn their promissory notes into hard cash. Your metal buried underground or in your treasure chests, he wrote, need not be considered safer than in banks or in paper if anarchy overtakes us. He counselled his readers not to lose their nerve or imagine tomorrow there will be no government. Gandhi's thoughts on the panic were prompted by the letters that he received during this period. But he too felt the tremors of the Nazi occupation of Western Europe. Gandhi himself observed that if Britain and France failed, the history of Europe and the history of the world will be written in a manner no one can foresee. Now, in the past on this podcast, I've talked a lot about how the fall of France blows the Allied position or Allied war strategy out of the water, even though America wasn't a combatant ally of Great Britain at the time. The Roosevelt administration looked with horror at the fall of France and the prospects for winning or becoming engaged in a future war, or supporting Great Britain to stay afloat during the continuing war. And it's clear also from this that the eyes of India and perhaps much of Southeast Asia was on Europe as well. And in those few weeks, that small part of the world from the German border through to the coast of northern France, incorporating the Netherlands, Belgium, and the Ardennes forest, was the kind of the pivot upon which world history seemed to turn. And Gandhi, a very astute judge of the way in which kind of historical winds were blowing, was able to see that. As the Germans advanced through the Low Countries, Gandhi's political colleagues were equally alarmed. Rajendra Prasad, one of Gandhi's followers from Bihar province, was deeply distressed. He wrote that Hitler seemed to be determined to wipe the weaker nations of the world from the map. And he felt that the anger that he'd felt towards the British for unilaterally declaring war in their high-handed and arrogant manner was somewhat negated by these alarming turns of events. And this is the interesting bit. He wrote that our duty to help the British in defeating Germany and to helping stop the rot was abundantly clear. And this was perhaps an indication that India's political classes were having a real change of heart based on the shifting facts on the ground, and that this was bringing about fundamental changes in priorities. Nowhere in there is talk of how this will kind of help the Congress Party to leverage for independence later on. It was a case of the British must be supported now, really, to prevent civilization from collapsing. Other members of the Congress Party argued for the formation of a national coalition government to steer India through the war. Nehru rejected this. He said, "Hitler may win this war, but Hitler will not dominate the world. He will fall as Napoleon fell." Nehru saw in the British a people with an immense lack of humility. He recognised that even though bombs were falling on the east end of London, even though the RAF was fighting for its life in the skies above the South Downs, the British had lost none of their imperial ambitions in India and none of their perceived sense of a right to rule, and that there had been no kind of readjustment in the British outlook, no sense of diminished expectations in India. He referred to it as a singular obtuseness from the British. And he said that even worse than that, the supposedly more progressive Labour Party mirrored exactly the kinds of things that Churchill's Conservative Party was saying when it was in government with them. Nehru suggested that Congress should mirror this obtuseness and not change their stance in the slightest. He believed that the British Empire had had its day and it was best to let it die, and the war that he believed Hitler would eventually lose anyway would put such intense pressures on the British Empire that it would collapse. And in that, he was actually quite prescient, because that's roughly kind of what happens. He said, "It will go to pieces, and not all the king's horses and all the king's men will be able to put it together again." So he really did caution that pro-British Indian politicians keep their powder dry. At the end of June 1940, the leadership of the Congress Party met at Wardha, and it was there that Gandhi, who was sympathetic with Britain's plight, looked at things through the prism not of politics but of morality. He asked the working committee of the Congress Party to show its faith in non-violence by stating publicly at this moment that an independent India would not maintain an army for defence against external aggression or internal disorder. This seemed to be at the start of a second global war in a generation, and bizarre and obtuse statement to make. There were plenty who were astounded by this request from Gandhi and dismissed it as one of his particular eccentricities. To rule out a state ever being able to exercise force was seen as absolutely inconceivable, especially in the present moment. The debate, though, did have political undercurrents, and it did have political connotations because of the current crisis. The former Premier of Madras, Rayagolapalachari, had led the resistance to Gandhi's arguments, and he had, following the fall of France, seen an opportunity. He believed that if a deal could be struck with the British, that the British might get the India that they wanted, which would fill the space of a French ally. Rayagolapalachari set out to convince his colleagues that now the British were in dire straits, that Indian manpower could be really brought to bear to give massive leverage to the independence movement. The argument quickly gained adherents, and significant members of the party joined, and Gandhi duly lost the argument. But Gandhi asked to be liberated from the policy dictates of the Congress Party on this particular issue, and he asked for this to be publicly announced and acknowledged. And on the 21st of June, the Working Committee of the Congress Party published a resolution stating so, and that allowed Gandhi to publicly chart a separate course and make arguments about war, peace, and independence that were often going to be at odds with what the Congress Party actually argued. Gandhi's public breach with the Congress Party sent a kind of shockwaves throughout the party, as he was not just one of the leading members of the Congress Party, but the spiritual focus of the party. The working committee resumed its discussions on the 3rd of July, but these actually exacerbated the situation, the rift between Gandhi and the party. The resolution demanding independence came back on the table at this point, and the resolution was an offer, within the resolution was an offer to withdraw non-cooperation, which had been instituted in 1939 as a result of Linlithgow's declaration of war. And that would happen if central government, and including defence and military power, was placed under the charge of the national government, not under the control of the viceroy. Gandhi said that he was not afraid to wield kind of political responsibility. He said, "Someday or other we will have to take it," but he's insisted it was important to find out first whether Gandhi's approach or Rayagolapalachari's argument was actually favoured by the majority of Indian voters. He urged gauging opinion about India and the war from the provinces first, and about what kind of Indian people wished to see emerge as a result of the war. Would it be a militarist or a pacifist India? Nehru had argued that actually power had come through non-cooperation. He had said that by refusing to cooperate with the viceroy, that the Congress Party was actually mirroring Indian people's values, and the anger that Indian people felt about being included in the war. Now, to some extent, Nehru was right, and to some extent he was standing on shifting sand, because the events in France had alarmed people to such an extent that preparing India to fight, preparing India to be involved in the war, was becoming not necessarily popular, but seen as a necessity. So stepping in and seizing control of government, and with the connivance of the British, could potentially, in Nehru's eyes, rob the Congress Party of the radicalism that connected it to Indian people who were sick of British rule. However, by standing back and also doing nothing, that ran the risk of being seen as complacent during a situation of world war, when unfortunately unpleasant compromises have to be made in order to make sure that the state continues functioning and that the public at large is protected from the threat of invasion. The resolution that was put forward by Raya Gopalachari proclaimed that if its suggestion were taken up by the government, Congress would throw in its full weight in the efforts for effective organisation for the defence of the country. So here we've got some extraordinary events that in a situation which hasn't really involved in during World War yet, but where the shift towards global war is almost inevitable. That you have these debates happening within the Congress Party, and it's really a product of the chaotic nature of colonial rule, of which group actually has the legitimacy, and where does political power come from? Where does political legitimacy come from? Does it come from the Viceroy and ultimately from King George VI, Emperor of India? Or does it come from the Indian people? And India is in this sort of hiatus between imperial rule and mass democracy. Srinath Raghavan writes of Nehru. He said, "It may be that the dancing star of independence may emerge out of chaos, but it may also be that nothing but black clouds may emerge out of chaos." So we're very used to looking back and seeing certainties because these events already happened, and we can chart a kind of a logical path through them. But there was no certainty in Nehru's mind that independence would be the outcome of the Second World War, and it was not a given on any by any stretch of the imagination in 1940 that within 7 years' time India would be independent. And Nehru also had to contend with the new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who had come to power in May 1940. Nehru was well aware that Churchill had been one of the most vociferous anti-independence politicians of the 1930s, when greater home rule and autonomy for India was a consensus position in the Labour, Liberal and Conservative parties in the mid-1930s. Churchill was an outspoken opponent of any kind of devolution of power. Nehru welcomed the fall of Chamberlain, and he welcomed in practical terms, the rise of what he referred to as the far more able and virile Mr. Churchill, and said that England now speaks with a different and sterner voice so far as her defence is concerned, but in other matters, has there really been any change? He was not a fan of Leo Amery, who was the new Secretary of State for India. When Amery took over on the 10th of May 1940, Nehru wrote a note on Amery's past support for Japanese imperialism in Manchuria. In a speech in the Commons in 1933, Nehru recalled Amery had said, "Our whole policy in India stands condemned if we condemn Japan," which obviously tells you an awful lot about the nature of political morality in Westminster at these times. Leo Amery had lived a remarkably similar life to Churchill. Amery had been born in India. He'd been one of Churchill's old Harrovians. He'd been at Harrow and had gone to All Souls College in Oxford. And like Churchill, he'd served as a correspondent during the Boer War. And like Churchill, he initially he went straight into the Conservatives. Churchill obviously joining the Liberal Party initially. And Churchill, like Amery, Amery, like Churchill, was also an ardent imperialist. Amery said, "The empire is not external to any of the British nation. It is something like the kingdom of heaven within ourselves," mixing Christian and imperialist rhetoric and articulating what many British people, both of the elite classes and otherwise believed at the time that the empire was really a byword for civilization itself, and would act as a bulwark against the barbarism of Germany. He was one of the few mavericks like Churchill who sat on the backbenches as a critic of appeasement, but when Churchill's administration formed, Amory was given the job of Secretary of State for India, and the policies that Amory pursued were shaped around his kind of Christian evangelism and imperialism. He didn't believe in the division of India, the partition of India, and the idea that Churchill had of fostering division between Hindus and Muslims. But he did believe that religious differences in India were intractable. He believed it was possible for some kind of agreement between Hindus and Muslims in India, and that partition should be avoided and was unnecessary. But precisely what that kind of compromise, what that kind of agreement would look like, is unclear. Amory argued for dominion status for India, and that India would have to devise its own constitution. But again, what the constitution would look like, based on the intractable differences of opinion in India, again was uncertain. But even though Amory recognised that there was a huge divide in India, he refused to accept that it was insurmountable. Amory contacted Linlithgow and asked whether the Maharajas of the princely states, the Congress Party and the Muslim League could all be got together in some kind of political union to debate and discuss the war, thus kind of tying them up, really, keeping them occupied while the Viceroy took on the job of directing India at war. The response that Linlithgow gave to Amory was rather icy and said, essentially, don't go meddling with things that you don't understand, and don't go creating the climate for change in India that you can ill control from Westminster. As we shall see, the events were moving faster than the British were able really to control. And in the next few podcasts on India, we'll continue with this story and look at how the conditions of the war shaped the move towards independence, and eventually how by the end of the war power had drained completely from the hands of the British. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this and found it useful. Do remember to support us on Patreon, and I'll leave the link below, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.